Well, once again, ladies and gentlemen, we are watching something of a revolt going on in the right. Not that it ever really stops for any extended period of time, but this time, none other than Nick Fuentes has gone out and encouraged everyone to not just vote against Republicans, not just vote against Trump, not just shut down the entire Republican Party. Nope. He is actually coming right out and saying, I'm voting Democrat in 2026 because white people can play both sides too. The GOP broke every single promise: Epstein file cover-up, regime change war in Iran, and no mass deportations. The GOP must be purged and burned to the ground in 26. Hostile takeover in 28. So there you have it. There you have it. The leader of the Groypers has essentially come in and said the Republican Party needs to be destroyed. And what we're going to talk about today is we're going to ask the question. We're going to ask the question, does he have a point? Right? We're going to consider that. And is his solution the one that is most likely to bring about the things that he believes are failed promises? All of that coming up today's episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in studio, the Oracle of Virginia, our resident historian, Christian Hines. How are you doing?
Today is going to be an interesting podcast.
Well,
boy.
Look, let's analyze the claims first, right? The GOP broke every single promise: Epstein file cover-up, regime change war in Iran, and no mass deportations.
Well, he's blatantly lying about that last one. He's blatantly lying about that last one. You had something like 2.2 million people self-deport in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
Last year marked the first time in 50 years that you had net emigration out of the U.S.
Yeah.
More people left than came in.
Yeah.
That hadn't been the case really since Hart-Celler, when we basically adopted effectively a full-blown open borders type policy to the entire world. And the number of deportations in terms of illegals being deported versus illegals entering the country was also net negative for the first time in decades last year.
Yeah.
So this idea that there were no mass deportations, that's just a total lie. Total lie from Nick Fuentes, which is actually kind of standard operating procedure for this little punk. I mean, this guy is an absolute sorry, I'm like going to go on a rant here. Like,
go.
This guy's an absolute weasel. He will go out there and say, believe me, guys, like, we've crossed a red line. You were taking out billboard advertisements in 2024 telling people not to vote for Trump because he was going to mass import people into the country.
Mm-hmm.
We were going to have mass migration, but it was going to be legal instead of illegal, whereas Biden, it was both, really. But so, I mean, he was already counter signaling in 2024. He was telling people not to vote. He was doing this whole.
Well, and then when Trump won, he's like, "We did it!" Like, wait, what?
Yeah, and then people were calling him out, and then his followers were like, "Oh, fell for the bait award." And now those same exact people are saying, "I'm voting for Democrats this election." So a portion of them are trolls. A portion of them are just lying through their teeth. And at this point, he's firmly placed himself on the enemy side of the friend-enemy distinction. Mm-hmm. If you're going to go out there and say, vote for the party that imported 10 million people into this country illegally, staged riots in major American cities in order to prevent their deportation, talking about no mass deportations, who's preventing the mass deportations, Nick?
Mm-hmm.
Who's preventing them?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, that's right. The Democrats that you've endorsed. Here's another one. We just did a podcast the other day talking about the primary results in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the James, what was it? Tallarico? Yeah. People were looking at his past tweets, especially from the height of the Great Awakening, right? 2020, 2021. Mm-hmm. Tallarico had some tweets talking about how having white skin is a virus.
Mm-hmm.
He was talking about, the racism pandemic.
This is my question, because Fuentes has America First and Christ is King in his bio. It's like, okay, you just told everyone to vote for James Tallarico, who believes that God is non-binary and that Jesus is really big on abortion. Now, what the statement is going to be and what some of his followers will say is exactly what you did. It's like, oh, hey, boomer, you really don't get what he's doing here. Like, no, I get it. I think what he's advocating for is accelerationism. The problem is that I don't understand how there's a number of ways.
Yes, he's advocating for accelerationism.
There's a number of ways that you could do accelerationism. I don't see how it benefits you to openly advocate for people to vote for Democrats, the party that hates this country, and the party that hates your stated faith, and it's the whole like hostile takeover in 28. I'll go back to this. When I look at the Epstein file cover up, I will say right off the bat that I accept the fact that the GOP and the Trump administration deserves pain for the Epstein file cover up. But you know who also covered up the Epstein files? the Democratic Party. So why is it that, and then regime change war in Iran. Here's the other thing I would say. Like he was saying something similar, and so was Tucker, and so was Candace, and everything else when it came to the first strike in Iran. This is one of the things I have an honest question on. What was because I think some people heard Trump talk about foreign wars and looked at it from the perspective of he doesn't want a repeat of Iraq and Afghanistan. That doesn't mean he's never going to use military force overseas. He just doesn't want an Iraq and Afghanistan. He doesn't believe in this idea of going over and using massive amounts of U.S. troops to facilitate regime change or to facilitate nation building, and more specifically, nation building. There's other people that looked at it as he's not allowed to do anything overseas anymore. and I want your take on, which do you think is the fairer interpretation of the things that Trump was saying, both from his first term and when he ran for his second term? Do you think it was more of, we're not going to do Iraq and Afghanistan style conflicts, or do you think it was, we're not going to get involved in anything, or do you think it'd be reasonable to interpret it either way?
The problem with accelerationism.
Well, no, answer my question first about the whole Trump, because he's basically saying that Trump lied, Tucker's saying Trump lied, Candace is saying Trump lied, other people are saying Trump lied, because between Venezuela, the first strike in Iran, the second strike in Iran, and money still going to Ukraine, they're saying, well, he lied about this.
I mean, I guess it depends on how you want to frame American foreign policy. I think that two things can be true simultaneously. One, Trump's actions in Venezuela did work to our benefit. I mean, he had Doug Burgum was down there talking with the acting president of Venezuela the other day, apparently negotiating a trade deal. Venezuela put out a statement after the Iran war kicked off, and it was actually quite mild. It was like, we regret that, there's all this violence going on. And we usually they would say, these American dogs, they suck. But they knew they're like, they got the marching orders. They were like, okay, we're going to put out just a pro-peace statement. Yeah. Venezuela's president tweeted, again, acting president, right? Tweeted the other day, she was like, I'm looking forward to working, more with our American partner. They've gotten the memo.
Oh yeah,
they've gotten the memo. They've started to,
and they're selling oil to us and not China and Russia.
There's apparently a deal for American companies to go into Venezuela to now do gold mining.
Yeah.
So we're starting up trade for the first time in basically a decade. We're in talks now to resume diplomatic relations. They've started to release political prisoners. Don't get me wrong. There's still more stuff that I think should be done. I think their socialist party probably needs to be dismantled.
Yeah.
They need to probably hold a new round of elections, although maybe not. When you think about the fact that Venezuela has...
I don't want to dig too far into this. I mean,
sure, but the point...
The 10,000 foot level is...
Yeah, the 10,000... I was about to say maybe not because Venezuela voted for socialism multiple times. Yeah. But point is that the operation in Venezuela almost certainly worked to our benefit, and it was in our own backyard.
Yeah.
So I think that you can praise certain actions of the Trump administration on the foreign policy stage without endorsing everything that he's done. I have not endorsed the war that's going on in Iran. I've very explicitly, intentionally not endorsed this conflict. There's certain elements of it that I've been like, okay, that's kind of cool. Like the blowing up the ship with the submarine, that was kind of cool. Not gonna lie.
Yeah.
But I've intentionally not said I support this war, I support regime change, because I don't. Mm-hmm. I don't. I think that you can have an honest debate, and maybe that's a whole nother topic for another day of to what degree is this in our interests versus not in our interests. Mm-hmm. I don't think it is, at least right now. I genuinely think that this is probably something that benefits Israel more than the U.S., and I think that reasonable people can disagree. I don't think Fuentes is being reasonable about this.
No.
I do think there is an argument to be had. I don't think it's reasonable, and I think on the whole, when you look at ultimately where he's applying the friend-enemy distinction, he is applying it in the sense that his friend-enemy distinction is Jews are the enemy, and anything that's in opposition to Israel and Jews in general, that's what I support, even if it might be to the detriment of America, which that is not America first. If you're applying the friend-enemy distinction, the enemy should be leftism in all of its forms and manifestation. And at the end of the day, I look at him, I look at his movement, and I realize now, okay, you would rather, I'm seeing people like Jake Shields, it's a good example of this, who's saying at this point, I'd rather, I wish that Iran did have a nuclear weapon. So let me get this straight. Some of these people would rather nuclear weapons be deployed against their home countries as long as it means Israel gets wiped off the map.
Yes.
That is where we're at in terms of the level of derangement right now.
Yeah.
That is not an appropriate application of the friend-enemy distinction. This gets back to what I was trying to say earlier about accelerationism. The biggest argument against accelerationism is that there are still liberals in South Africa. Mm-hmm. That should tell you everything you need to know about how accelerationism doesn't actually work.
As bad as it got, and as obvious as it became that socialism was a bad idea, it doesn't matter. They're still there voting for it. But I think you hit on to something else here, and this is one of the things that when I listen to. So, for instance, Thomas Massie is against what's going on right now, and Thomas Massie will make arguments, some that I find convincing, and others that I don't. But I tend to understand where Thomas Massie is coming from, and I see an intellectual consistency there. Even when I disagree with him, I understand it. When I see Jake Shields, Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, and Candace Owens, I see two things going on here, which puts them in a different category for me when they render analysis. It's not that everything they say is incorrect or every point that they bring up is wrong. It's that there seems to be an underlying motivation there that goes way beyond that for me, discounts that this is all about America first for them. When I see people defending the Iranian regime, when I see people defending Hamas, I'm like, okay, we've lost the plot here, and it's absolutely true. If I don't want Trump involved in wars in the Middle East. If Trump was bombing Jerusalem right now, Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Jake Shields would probably be cheering him on. And that's where I go, like, there's something happened, and I don't know exactly what it is. I know I've heard the arguments, but something has happened where some of these guys are Israel last, not America first. And
that's what all these people are.
Well, and that's the part where, again, I don't put...
And I say this as somebody that is deeply critical of Israel.
Yes. And this is where I don't put Massie in that category. I don't put some of these other guys in that category who just want... They want to end the foreign aid. They don't want the United States involved in any conflicts unless there's a... Matt Walsh actually did a really, really, I thought, a reasonable explanation. He goes, I don't think the cost-benefit analysis adds up in Iran. He goes, I do think it added up in Venezuela. I do think it added up with kind of the tough talk about Greenland, but I don't think it adds up in Iran, and that's just where I'm at. And I'm looking at that going, I get it. I think you can make a reasonable argument that there's a pathway where it could add up. So, and for instance, when we look at like Lebanon kicking out Hezbollah and now fighting against Hezbollah, when we look at the fact that, now we actually, for the first time, we have Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and on the same side in a conflict against Iran.
Well, they're all being bombed by Iran.
Yes, right. So this is the part where you look at it, it's like, has Iran overplayed their hand in such a way to where this could lead to the dismantling of all of the terrorist proxies that they've operated with by, through, and with for the past 3 to 4 decades? And the answer is yes, that's a possible outcome. Would that be in the U.S. interest? Yes, I think it would. Is it more in Israel's interest? Yes. Is it more in Saudi Arabia's interest? Yes. But does that mean it's not in our interest? No, it can be in our interest too. And so that's the distinction I make when I'm analyzing these things. But again, I haven't said, yeah, this is all awesome. I've said we need to be really, really cautious about how we proceed here. But my point in articulating all of that is that Matt Walsh and I disagree. Well, Matt Walsh and I have disagreements with respect to what's going on in Iran. But I totally understand where he's coming from, and his logic makes sense to me, and it's absolutely pro-American logic. I think my logic is pro-American logic. But when I look at what Fuentes is saying, that doesn't strike me as pro-American logic. And if somebody wants to convince me I'm wrong, I'm willing to accept that. But I already know what I'm going to get from this episode. And it isn't going to be, well, Nick, let's carefully think about Nick Fuentes' points. What I'm going to get is, did you get your 7,000 shekels from Israel? Right? Or you just don't understand what he's saying? Or you're a cuck,
or they'll just respond, I don't care, I'm voting Democrat. That's fine. You can go vote for the party of mass migration, open borders, transgenderism, abortion, the funny thing is that Fuentes calls himself pro-white, and he's endorsing candidates who, again, Tallarico said, this is his words. These are not my words. He said, having white skin is a virus. It's part of the racism virus, and we all carry it around with us. Like, have we forgotten the Great Awakening? The whole point of DEI, the whole point of all of the elements of the Great Awakening was to explicitly attack white men, particularly white men, also white women, but especially white men for their immutable characteristics, drive them out of institutions, drive them out of elite decision-making processes, basically cast them to the fringes of society and remove them from centers of power. That was the whole intentional point. They openly said this on the left for years during the Great Awakening. We were talking early this morning, and I brought up an example, like when I was in my 20s in college. I was like 20 exactly. And it was like the first time that I had somebody attack me for being a white man. And remember, this is not benefit of hindsight, right?
Yeah.
I didn't have the ability to look back at the Great Awakening. This was the start of it. And I was blindsided. I felt like a truck had hit me. I was like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Little did I know what was about to happen for the next 12 years. And for somebody like Fuentes to go out there and be like, you know, I'm against all of this stuff. I'm against all the anti-white racism on the left. And then to endorse the very political movement that is pushing all of this stuff is, like you said, it's a form of accelerationism, but accelerationism doesn't work. I gave the South Africa example. Here's another example. If accelerationism actually worked, then this entire war is excellent news for the mullahs in Iran. Because once the regime gets overthrown and you have regime change and the country collapses and they all get killed and they're all wiped out and you have a pro-US or pro-Israeli puppet regime put in place, certainly from their perspective, well, then you're just going to red pill all the normies and then they're going to be begging for a return to real theocratic Islamism under the Ayatollah.
Well, the other thing I don't understand is what happened with Fuentes and the rest of these guys where they no longer seeing Islam as a threat. And I think I know part of the answer to that. I think it's because they consider wokeism as a threat. Like, I think we agree that wokeism is a threat, even though Fuentes is now openly calling for you to support the party of woke as part of his accelerationist strategy. So if you think that wokeism is a threat and you think Israel or Jews in general are your major threat, well, then now all of a sudden Islam becomes an ally. And as I look at Tucker and Candace and Fuentes, I see more and more of this idea where it's like, well, you know where you don't have wokeism? Tehran. Right? And it's like, okay, that's true, but is that your only option? Like, and to suggest that, you know, Islamism isn't a threat. Like, have you been watching the UK? Now their answer would be, it's like, well, then that's just, you got to deal with the domestic issues. That's an immigration issue. And I would agree, but I just think it's interesting that, okay, well then why would you vote in the party that you think is going to actually allow this to accelerate? Why would you, because if you look at what the Democrat strategy has been, the Democrat strategy has not been, oh, I just want more welfare programs. The Democrat strategy has been, how do we consolidate power in such a way to where we make it impossible for us to lose elections? And I use Virginia as an example of this right now. There's a reason why as soon as none of those guys ran on, we're going to completely not cooperate with, you know, immigration enforcement when it comes to violent illegal immigrants. And yet that's what they did day one. None of them campaigned on this idea of we're going to raise your taxes on everything we possibly can. And yet that's what they started to do on day one. They didn't run on any of that, but that's what they did. Now, why are they doing these things? Well, because they're sending a message to the business community, which is you will either play ball with us or we'll destroy you. So you better donate the correct way. You better let us put our people on your corporate boards, because that's the only way you get a seat at the table. And they're doing all of this to set up an infrastructure which makes it impossible for them to lose, because one, they will control the bureaucracy. They will rapidly expand and then control the bureaucracy. They will rapidly expand the welfare state to create client voters. And then they will allow for mass immigration, illegal immigration, and then they will closely work it to where they can make it easier for them to vote so they can't lose elections. And so it's like, if you understand all that, and Nick Fuentes has even said that, well, then how does your accelerationist strategy work if every time you give them power, they use power in order to make sure they don't lose it again? Like, how does that work?
I sent you a tweet that you should definitely pull up, because this, I think, embodies just really the mindset of where some of these people are at, and also how utterly stupid this mindset is.
I got it up now.
Look at what I'm quoting first down here. He's right. Accelerationism is the last option left. Vote for 10 million more immigrants every year, barring white men from jobs, emptying prisons. The system must be pushed as hard as possible for chances to reach a breaking point. So that's the Groyper plan to save America.
Yeah.
Bring in 10 million migrants a year,
Yeah.
bar white men from holding jobs, and empty the prisons. So basically, your plan to win is give your enemies everything that you want and allow them to kill you. Yeah. And once you're lying dead in a ditch, then you win. Yeah, that's how you win. You win.
Well,
you win by giving them everything you want and letting them kill you.
I have your tweet up here that I like. We need a new right-wing discourse centered on being functionally indistinguishable from the left while pretending to be an edgy contrarian about it. That's exactly what it is at this point. I'm looking at these guys and what they're advocating for, and it's like, you want more left-wing policies than you want right-wing policies. And on some of this, and this has always been the distinction between kind of like the fascist angle versus the communist angle, is the communists, broke everything down by essentially by economics, and the fascists tend to break things down by race or nationality. But when you look at what they actually want as far as like programs, they want strongman totalitarian style government. They want more centrally planned control of the economy. And you're looking at this going, yeah, you guys are not as far away from each other as you think. You just want to use the state for different things. And
again, like there's so many historical examples of this mindset right here of just give your enemies, give people who explicitly hate you everything they want and allow them to kill you. And once you're dead lying in a ditch, then you've actually really won. Like by that logic, Germany's utter defeat in World War II was actually a big triumph for Nazism because once the German people are suffering from, bourgeois Western liberalism on one hand and, Bolshevism and Marxism on the other hand, right? The country's literally split in two and occupied. Well, then the German people are going to be begging for a return to real Nazism.
Yeah.
This mindset is just ridiculous, right? You could apply to the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union collapses and Russia, the Russian economy implodes and, the 15 Soviet republics break off and do their own thing and Russia loses its status as a great power, well, then people are going to be begging for a return to real Stalinism. You could just do this over and over and over again.
Yeah.
There's this account, currently he's deactivated himself. He does this thing all the time where he will pop back up on Twitter and then he'll disappear for like months at a time. But the account's called Mystery Grove, and he has written whole articles about this.
Yeah.
On Substack. He has tweets. You can't find him right now because he's deactivated. He'll come back at some point. He does this all the time. But he had this tweet that was kind of similar when Bashar al-Assad's regime fell. And he was like, no, this is great. Like, once the Syrian people get, Western liberalism, they're going to be begging for a return to real Baathism. Yeah. Like it's like, again, you can just do this over and over and over again. Making things worse. You do not, in fact, I know it's shocking, but you do not, in fact, win by losing. Yeah. By giving your enemies everything they want, and allowing yourself to lose everything to the point, in some cases, of getting yourself killed, you don't, in fact, actually win that way. If you have an ideology or a worldview or just a set of principles, or a friend group that you want to defend, or an enemy group that you want to defeat, you don't actually get to that end state by doing the opposite of what it is that you want.
The thing that again, I'm gonna separate Fuentes out from like Tucker or Candace for a moment. The other thing too that I've noticed about Nick Fuentes is that he will make these comments about, saying Hitler was cool, or he'll say that, he's a big fan of Stalin. Well, Hitler and Stalin obviously hated one another, right? Like they were considered like arch enemies. So how do you like both of these people when one wanted, National Socialism and one wanted communism? And how do you end up liking these various figures throughout history that seem to be diametrically opposed with one another? And what it really comes down to is Nick Fuentes is attracted to strong men. That might be figurative and literal. I don't know. But the point is that he will support anybody that he sees as being, it's kind of the joke about the Russians where you're like, why does Stalin poll well? He was a strong Russian leader, right? Fuentes has the same thing. He came right out and said, he goes, they all want to talk about liberty, 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 but it's really about order. And if you look at Fuentes, right, I don't think Fuentes is an idiot. I think Fuentes is actually very gifted in a lot of the things he does. I don't like it, but I don't think he's an idiot. But he is attracted to what he perceives to be as strong leaders that simply restore order in the way that Fuentes wants order restored. And so the issue becomes is Fuentes will point out things where he wants order restored. And a lot of people look at that and be like, well, that makes sense. Yeah, I want to get immigration under control. I want the people punished for the Epstein stuff. I want, these are the things I want. And I want a leader that's going to do those things. Well, one of the issues is that obviously within our constitutional republic, we don't elect a president as a dictator. They can't just come in and do all the things that you want. And you will see Fuentes criticize Trump on things where it's like he doesn't even have the power to do that. And for Fuentes, that's a problem. And that's why strongmen like Hitler and Stalin and maybe the Ayatollah, they went in and they got things done. They didn't let things like liberal democracy stand in the way of them achieving their important objectives. And I see this trend with Fuentes where he is drawn to people that basically screw the rules. If the rules aren't working, screw them. Go in and do what needs to be done. And so right now, even though most of us see Trump as probably the strongest executive we've had in a long time, he sees it as no, he's still weak because he's not achieving the things he wants. And when we point out that, well, yeah, the Constitution's kind of standing in the way of some of this, I think Fuentes would say, well, that's the problem too. I think Nick Fuentes would be perfectly happy with a Nick Fuentes style, authoritarian coming in and imposing his will. Because I think that's what he's attracted to.
I mean, you've put me in an awkward position because I'm not going to defend liberal democracy. I'm not a fan of liberal democracy. I think that liberalism and democracy are actually enemies, not allies. But that's a whole nother tangent.
So I think let's distinguish between liberal democracy and what we might call the original intention of our constitutional republic. You will agree those are two different things.
Those are different things in a way because on one hand, they're different things. On another hand, they're actually, in some ways, the same thing.
They're related. They're not the same.
It's obvious to identify how they were different. Mm-hmm. The constitutional system was not mass democracy. It was definitely not mass democracy. It was not universal suffrage. You can go read Madison's notes. The founders were warning against mass democracy. Yeah. It was in many respects a mixed regime, right? There were monarchical elements in the presidency, aristocratic elements in the Senate.
He was trying to do the
Polybius, avoiding the anacyclosis by replicating the Roman system.
Yes.
So in that respect, it was not liberal nor democratic. On another hand, though, it was democratic in the sense that the American people were a cohesive polity. There was a unified pre-political we that you could build the constitutional system off of. The whole we the people establishing that very constitutional system, the people knew who they were. And the United States had a cohesive identity. It had a cohesive background, history, traditions, religion, all of those things. It was democratic in the true sense that democracy is ruled by the people and they knew who the people were. They weren't something in a universal abstract. Oh, well, the people included Muslims from the Middle East. No, they did not in 1787. So it was democratic in the sense that there was homogeneity. And I mean that in a very deep sense, not just in usually when people use the word homogeneity, they mean it like in a racial sense. I mean it in more than just that.
It was a cultural sense. There was a lot more homogeneity.
There was a unified American polity.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it was democratic. And in another sense, it was liberal because the constitutional system was influenced by the Enlightenment. It was influenced by liberalism in that sense. So on one hand, yes, it wasn't liberal or democratic. But on another hand, it kind of was liberal and democratic.
Yeah.
And so there is a bit of tension there, but that probably is a whole nother podcast for another day talking about political philosophy. The point here, because I don't want to get too distracted, because look, I could spend all day long philosophically dissecting all this stuff.
Yeah.
But the point here is that the accelerationist take doesn't work at the end of the day. Now, people will draw a distinction and be like, but Christian, you endorsed Rupert Lowe and Restore Britain, especially against Nigel Farage in Reform UK, and definitely against the Tories. Yeah. You were even telling people a few years ago, 0 seats. That was the whole plan for the British right, was vote the Tories out of office. They're traitors. They're leftists. Carl Benjamin called them a gay liberal party, and they definitely were. They were flying the trans flag when they were in office. there is a different set of political strategies based on the political system that you're operating in.
Yeah.
If we were operating in Stalinist Russia, I would be proposing a very different set of political strategies.
Yeah.
If you were in the UK, which is a multi-party parliamentary system where parliament is sovereign,
Yeah.
they had a whole civil war that determined this, right? Parliament is, to use the Schmittian phrase, the sovereign that decides on the exception.
Yes.
There are no checks and balances. They have absolute power.
Yeah, there's no written constitution even.
There's nothing that Donoso Cortez famously said about 150 years ago that Parliament can do anything except declare a man to be a woman. And even that is now arguably up for debate, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so if you're living in a system like that, a multi-party parliamentary democracy where there's no checks and balances, no written constitution, right?
Yeah.
And Parliament can do effectively anything. It can change the dynasty.
Yeah.
It can change the country, anything. The type of political tactics that you would engage in that system are very different than a written constitutional federalist system with clear checks and balances and a solid two-party system that has been with us effectively since the founding of our country. Now, what those parties are sometimes change, right?
Yeah.
You had the Whigs, the Federalists,
Sure.
they're dead now, but there has been effectively a two-party system since, Jefferson versus Adams.
Yeah.
And so the political tactics that you would employ in the United States are going to be different than the political tactics that you employ in the UK. What you would call accelerationism in one country might not be accelerationism in the other country.
Yeah.
And so when I endorse Rupert Lowe,
Yeah.
it's the same reason why I would say, no, the strategy that you should employ in the US is you have to take over one of the two parties.
Well, we're gonna get to that strategy for a second, because obviously there's a lot of things that is going on that are not working. But you know what does work? BRUNT workwear. That's right. These guys have some of the best workwear that you can have on the job. This right here is the Marin. It's one of my favorites because not only is it incredibly durable, it's incredibly comfortable. I'm telling you right now, when I first saw BRUNT advertise this as you don't got to break it in, it is comfortable on day one, I was like, we'll see. We'll see. Well, I did. And it is. I was completely blown away at how comfortable these work boots are. So if you're someone that is out there doing everything from working on construction sites to work around the house, go check out bruntworkwear.com for the full catalog of everything they got to help you with your job. You can go to bruntworkwear.com/Nick. That's bruntworkwear.com/Nick. Use code Nick. You're going to get $10 off your first order. Go over there and check it out. Give it a try, whether it's the pants, whether it's the boots, whatever. I'm telling you, you're going to be happy with the work that they do. All right, let's get back to the show. Okay, so when it comes to this whole idea of kind of what works. There's some interesting polling out there. And I was looking at this one from OpenSocietyFoundations.org, which is not an organization I'm necessarily fond of.
That's George Soros's group.
It is. But I wanted to see what they were saying over there. And you see some interesting bullet points here. People support democracy. Only 20% consider authoritarian countries more capable than democracies of delivering what citizens want. At the international level, 2/3, 60% of respondents feel that democracies contribute more to global cooperation. But then you go out of that, it says a large minority of young people surveyed, 42%, feel that military rule is a good way of running a country. Excuse me. A similar number, 35%, feel that having a strong leader who does not bother with elections or consulting legislatures is a good way of running a country. This compares to 20% that support military rule and 26% that are in favor of a strong leader in the 56 and above age bracket. So what you're seeing here is a shift that's taking place within younger populations. I'm willing to bet if we dove into those numbers a little bit more, and we're not going to right now, I bet we would find young men
it might be an absolute majority of them
showing up a lot more on this, in part because of the things that Fuentes has pointed out. So this is the part where, again, as much as I disagree with Fuentes ideologically and a number of other things, there are things that he has pointed out that are massive frustrations for young men, specifically young white straight men, because they've been the villain of every woke story in the West for the past 20 to 30 years. And you could say it goes back longer than that. Feminism was very, very adamant about being anti-men, starting in the, I mean, some people would say starting at its inception, but definitely in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it took a very, very anti-masculine role and a very, very pro-Marx view of the world.
And then you just build on top of that with DEI and the Great Awakening.
DEI, well, and the big thing that shifted was it used to be that a lot of this stuff was like contained in academia. So it's not that the way that it worked itself out in day-to-day life was, Hollywood would come up with stupid movies, or your journalists were, feminists, or, you had more gender studies departments. But what happens? What happens when culturally shaping institutions get taken over by a particular ideology? The ideology doesn't stay with those culturally shaping institutions. It now impacts your politics, which means it impacts your law, which means it impacts access. And so now all of a sudden, young white straight men are like, wait a second, so my odds of going to college are significantly lower now because I'm a straight white man? I thought we were against this. And what we find out is, no, the left was never against racism. It was all about which racism was most beneficial to them at a particular moment. It was all about which sort of sexism is beneficial to them at a particular moment. And it turns out grievance politics has a wide array that it has a very, very wide spectrum that it can operate from within. And what Fuentes has been saying is like, you know what? I mean, when he says this comment right here, white people can play both sides too. I think one of the things that he might be saying here that's kind of interesting is, I'm old enough to remember reading about when the Democratic Party was the white people party. When the Democratic Party was, because let's face it, if you're going to take on this identity politics, well, then it's all about which identities give you your power. And some of what I think Fuentes is suggesting right here is, okay, let's play the identity politics game. I think that's actually a big part of Fuentes is he believes in the identity politics.
Well, I mean, that's probably, believe it or not, not the only. There actually are a couple other areas. But like that's one of the areas that I actually probably agree with him on.
The difference is that he would say that the identity is that the most important aspect of the identity is I want to try to be fair to what he actually says. He puts a far stronger racial component onto identity politics than you do. Your identity politics, when you talk about it, you're essentially saying that, hey, look, if identity politics is inevitably the way politics works, inevitably, it's only a question of what are you holding up as the identity? You would say the identity is Americans or Western civilization. You wouldn't say the identity is white men, and as long as you're a white man, you're on my team. You would say, no, there's a certain mindset or worldview that I identify with, and that's the identity that you would hold up. Am I wrong on that?
It's more that there's some nuance there. So, like, put it this way. When one side of the political spectrum is explicitly attacking you for being a white man, you don't really get a choice in whether or not they're doing that. The only thing that you get a choice in is how do you respond. And if somebody's coming after you and saying, I am explicitly attacking you because of your immutable characteristics, the only winning move at that point, again, if you're operating in the realm of politics, and politics operates in the realm of collectivities, not individualities. I know that that is frustrating for libertarians and conservatives to wrap their head around, but that is how all politics operates on. It is around groups, not individuals. Mm-hmm. Now, you can have your goal to be, I want to liberate the individual, mm-hmm. right? But in order to do that, you still operate at a group level. I mean, the American Revolution was not fought on an individual level. It was fought, I mean, they had a Continental Army, they had the Founding Fathers, they had the Continental Congress, right? Those are all group level politics. So if another group, in this case the left, is coming along and explicitly attacking you on the basis of your sex and your race, the only winning move at that point is to look around for other people that share those characteristics in order to form a group to fight back against the left on that front. So when the left says, we hate white men, we're going to discriminate against them in college admissions and hiring and government contracting, right? There's a bill in Virginia to explicitly do that right now.
Yeah.
You have to look around for other people that share those characteristics and say, hey, we have a common enemy right now. Mm-hmm. We might disagree on other policies. There might be other white men out there that don't share my exact views on everything else. Mm-hmm. But you know what we do share in common? The fact that the left explicitly hates us for being white men. Mm-hmm. And insofar as the left continues to come after you for your immutable characteristics, the only winning move that you can play on a political front is to organize with other people to push back against that.
Okay, so I don't disagree with organize with other people to push back on that. The thing that I would push back on is that the moment you give into this idea that the most important thing that unites us is the enemy that's coming after us.
That doesn't mean that your personal identity has to be rooted in those things. I
get that. You're making a distinction between that which is moral and true and just and that which is practical with respect to pushing back against a threat.
I'm drawing a distinction between morality and politics in a way.
Well, okay.
To a degree, not an absolute degree, but to a degree.
Again, the Soviets were part of the Allies, right? Like I get that when you have a particular threat right there that is existential, you tend to team with who also shares the idea that that's an existential threat in order to take it out. But one of the things I would also argue that we've seen is that there's limited utility there. So it has to be understood. This is where I get frustrated with some of the neo-reactionary stuff, or where I get frustrated with some of this idea of the way people interpret Schmidt. It's this idea that, well, I'm just teaming with whoever is helping me defeat this current enemy. It's like, okay, but if you're not, I understand you've got to think the first move ahead, but you also have to be thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead. You can't, the guy that actually wins is the one that's actually thinking more strategically. And the problem that I have with a guy like Nick Fuentes is that he will immediately appeal to whatever is got you most angry right now. And then he will do the Motte and Bailey thing that the left always uses. He will say something outrageous, and then when he gets questioned on it, he pulls it into something more reasonable, and you're always left wondering, what does he really want? Right? Because when the left does it, I know what they really want. They want the thing they tell me they don't really want. Right? The moment the left says nobody wants to, I know as soon as they get power, that's what they want. Nobody wants to trans your kids. As soon as they get power, they try to trans your kids. Right? Like Virginia's a perfect example. Nobody wants to take your guns. As soon as they get power, they try to take the guns. Like every single time. With Fuentes, it's a little bit less clear. What does he really want? I don't know. And I think he kind of keeps it this way on purpose so that he can take whatever position he wants. That's why you saw, like, I'll bring it up again, because somebody responded to his post where he's like, I'm voting Democrat in 2026. And they pulled up Nick Fuentes' post from 2024. I'm trying to get GOP voters to withhold their vote from Trump. Watch me heading out to Michigan next week. And leftism was saying, as if you supported us in 2024. Right? But again, he would play this game. And then when Trump won, all of a sudden it's, oh yeah, we did it, everybody. Like, what do you mean we? The hell did you do? And even then when he was talking about we're going against Trump, he's like, Ben Shapiro voted against Trump the first time around. And Mark Levine was critical of Trump. And they don't get a say. You were critical of Trump, Fuentes. How come you don't get a say? Well, I'm only critical because he betrayed us. Well, okay, but then you accuse him of doing things he didn't do along with the things that maybe he did. And then you accuse him of other things, of not perfectly applying what you wanted or expected him to do versus what he actually said. Trump, since day one, Trump has said Iran will not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. That's always been his position. But now it's like, no, he's a liar because he didn't carry out what I heard him say, or he didn't carry out what you wanted him to carry out.
It's a lot deeper than one individual. It's also a lot deeper than one country and one conflict. At the end of the day, when people engage in politics, they will always employ a friend-enemy distinction against somebody. Otherwise, they're not engaged in politics. And even the ones who deny that they are actually doing so. Like, remember when we had that Super Bowl?
Well, okay, part of this.
Hang on, I'm going.
Wait a second. This whole friend-enemy thing. Part of the problem with this statement is that it's the way people interpret what an enemy is. Okay? If you and I disagree on a particular policy decision, are we enemies?
By the act of disagreeing, no. We're not enemies.
Okay, but
because an enemy, remember, an enemy is somebody, it's not even somebody, it's a movement. It's not, politics is about collectivities, not individuals. So a private individual that has a view on something is not necessarily an enemy just because they have a view on something.
But you see the
when
point
they organize with a group of like-minded people that have that
This is
view.
one of the issues that I have with everyone going around quoting Schmitt as if we're all supposed to, as if we all woke up yesterday and Schmitt is the one that wrote everything that we're supposed to understand or controls the world that we've been living in for the past
didn't say that.
Wait a second. No, Christian, actually, you kind of did. Because this has been one of my frustrations is I think Schmitt actually makes some good points. I think you're making some good points. But what it is people want to show up on the scene and say, friend enemy distinction for everything. And it's like, okay, wait a second. What do you mean by that?
Well,
and really, wait a second. Just let me freaking finish before you become my enemy in real time. I think what you mean by that is that you mean that whenever we're talking about political decisions for which force will be applied to achieve a particular end state, we automatically bifurcate based into who agrees with me on this application of power versus who disagrees with me on this application of power. And then we're going to come up with some sort of system, process, whatever it is, in order to adjudicate who wins and who loses. And for the purposes of that debate, I have friends and enemies. I have opposition and I have allies. And I think when you put it within that context, that makes sense, right? That plays out. The problem is that psychologically, we have a very different view of who my enemy is versus who temporary opposition might be on a particular point. If you are my fellow countrymen and we generally want the same things, but we disagree on a tax policy or a transportation policy, I don't categorize you as my enemy.
I agree.
The problem is that it doesn't get translated that way in popular parlance, right? That's the problem here, is that if it's everybody rushing to say the thing that's like, this is the more edgy thing, or this is going to reformat the way you think about something. And all of a sudden I'm using terms that have very different meanings to people.
So everything,
and that's what I think is problematic.
Everything you've said so far, I don't disagree with. This was all in service of a much deeper point. This is why I said this is actually a lot deeper. If you think about it, this is a lot deeper than Trump. It's a lot deeper than Iran.
Yeah.
Any particular conflict that's going on right now, the war in the Middle East with Iran. It's a lot deeper than all of this.
Yeah.
What's happened, and unfortunately, you also have to remember that for a lot of these people, what's happened is they've been one-shotted from some realization of something somewhere along the stretch. And then that is because not everybody, at the end of the day, not everybody's a genius. Not everybody has by the way, I'm not suggesting that I'm a genius
here. People are looking for a simple explanation of what the problem is.
Of something that might be much more complex.
An enemy they can focus on.
And point is that not everybody's studied all the philosophy. When I say all the philosophy, I mean more than just Schmitt here. I mean this in the broader sense. Put it this way. We were talking about, you brought up that poll earlier that showed white men. Well, you hinted that it might be white men, young white men that are far more, open towards strongman authoritarianism right now because they feel like the system's not working. But in general, younger people across the board are more open to alternatives to liberal democracy because they think liberal democracy is not working.
Yeah.
Well, bear with me. Like you were asking earlier, I don't know how we got to this point. Here's how I think we got to this point. Chunk of people tend to be, not all of them, but they tend to be younger white men.
Yep.
Grew up at the same time that the Great Awakening was peaking. They looked around and they were like, oh, I definitely have enemies. And I didn't pick them.
Yeah.
They picked me.
Yeah.
I was pretty apolitical, right? Have you seen the memes of I just wanted to play my video games. You should have left my video games alone.
Yeah.
Gamergate, all that stuff, right? There were people that were like, I was a libertarian and then you came along and attacked me. And guess what? I'm no longer libertarian now. I want to beat you.
Yeah.
And what happened for a chunk of Zoomers and young millennials is that they were basically thrust into a degree of existential politics that they were not prepared for.
Yeah.
They were young. They didn't know how this worked. And then they looked around and they were like, why is this happening to me? Why does it seem like all the institutions hate me?
Yeah.
Why does it seem like that I am everybody's villain and I'm 21 and I haven't done anything with my life yet? I don't have a career. I don't have a background. I haven't hurt anybody. I just want to live my life and everybody hates me. And people go in various directions at that point once you kind of get that red pill moment, right? Some go down the manosphere route. Some go down, some become basically like me, right? They become like post-liberal reactionaries or really neo-reactionaries, because there's not a reactionary is somebody that is drawing from an existing tradition, and there isn't really one to draw from. So it's more neo-reactionary. But other people go down the Nick Fuentes route. And the reason, and if you bear with me, I will explain all this and then explain what the flaw is here.
Mm-hmm.
People that went down Fuentes's pipeline are different than people that went down the route that I went down, because what they did is they engaged in pattern recognition.
Yeah.
They looked at all these institutions, right? They looked at all these things that were attacking them, and they determined the group that is overrepresented to them are Jews. And so therefore, that's where that friend-enemy distinction kicks in, because they were like, well, I know that all these things hate me.
Yeah.
Who's funding them? They're Jews. Who's running these institutions? They're Jews. So therefore, those are my enemy, and anything that works against them works in my favor. And so that's where I'm drawing the hard distinction between friend and enemy. This is an existential struggle. These things hate me, and these things are staffed by Jews. Therefore, Jews are my enemy. Anything that goes against Jews in the abstract, it works to my benefit. And then when you scale that out, this is how you get to complete idiots on Twitter saying things like, I want my own country to be nuked by Iran because it might be against the Jews.
Jake
and
Shields.
so that's how I win, right? I win by destroying my own country because, my country is an irredeemable, irredeemably controlled by Zog. Zionist occupied government is the phrase that they use, right?
Yeah.
And so therefore I want to destroy my own country because there's no saving it. It's just totally run by Jews. We just need, you just spiral into that type of mindset. But it starts
with a legitimate grievance.
It starts with a legitimate grievance, which is these institutions hate me. This culture hates me.
Yeah.
The government itself hates me. How do I fight back against that? And then it goes into the pattern recognition, which then goes into, Jews are 70, 80%, left leaning in the US. And so then eventually you get to that result.
And the other thing too that they look at is, because you could look at other demographics that are overwhelmingly left wing, but if they don't seem to have sufficient power to be a threat, then you treat them like they're not. Although Fuentes is kind of cast a wide net on that. But the part that's frustrating too, and I've run into this before, where it was Thomas Sowell talks about this, and again he used Malaysia as an example, where you had a lot of Han Chinese that had left China, ended up in Malaysia. And what did they all have in common? They had a heavy emphasis on tradition, family, education, and work ethic. So what ended up happening? The Han Chinese ended up doing better than the domestic Malays. And so what did Malaysia do? Well, the one thing that they actually had some power with was the vote. So they voted in a bunch of policies that were supposed to benefit domestic Malays above Han Chinese. What happened? It ended up being bad for everybody because they were essentially, what they were punishing at that moment was success. They were punishing successful characteristics within a particular environment, and that's obviously not a good idea. And Thomas Sowell has made that same argument with respect to the way that Jews have experienced pogroms in certain areas. And one of the things that he pointed out is the reason why the Han Chinese were easy to target in Malaysia is because they tended to stick together in their own organic communities. And you see the same thing with certain Jewish communities because of certain modes of dress, religious traditions, and things like that. They were easy to identify, isolate, and then attack.
The funny thing is that in the US, you're talking about a phenomenon where you have almost like a ethno-religious cultural enclave of its own, with its clearly distinct visual outward appearance versus the outgroup, the larger outgroup. But in the US, the Jews that meet that criteria
are more conservative.
It's the Jews that are in institutions that are attacking young white men are secular progressives that don't really present as a distinct group. They just present as just
and then there's the juxtapose, right? Like, so for everyone that they're going to point out, you can point out a Dennis Prager or a Ben Shapiro or a Ludwig von Mises.
You can also point out leftists that aren't Jews. Yes. And this is
real quick. This is my frustration with Tucker, Candace, Fuentes, Jake Shields, all of these guys, is they've decided to zero in on this one, and then now that's the thing. That's the easily identifiable thing that they can make the source of everything. And like you said, the part that's amazing, and I see this more with Shields and Fuentes and Owens than I do with Tucker, but you're almost seeing this this hatred for America, that America now represents this, woke progressivism. And so anything that's opposing woke progressivism is now that's their chief ally. And they're not even willing to accept entities within the United States, because the entities within the United States that oppose woke progressivism never move fast enough, or they're too aligned with,
It's third worldism is what it turns into. Yes.
Yeah.
But like, here's where, I always bring up the distinction. Here's where this kind of all falls apart. The reason that I think that these guys are wrong is because at the end of the day, Jews didn't invent liberalism.
No.
And the real problem is liberalism. At the end of the day, that is what has inevitably led to the moment that we all experienced over the last 12 years, where you had someone in the left attack you explicitly for being a white man, and that alone was justification to remove you from polite society, exclude you from institutions, strip you of any ability to wield political power for your own interests. They're the only ones that ever get to do that. You don't ever have any interests of your own, and we're basically going to destroy you and make your life miserable. The reason that we got to that end point, the Great Awakening is liberalism's end point. That is the final destination. Well, it's probably not the final destination, but that's certainly one of the stops along the way. And again, I said that there were different paths that people go down when they become red-pilled, when they were like, how did this happen? Like, I thought this was America. Why are people treating me like this? Why is the left acting this way? Some people went down the path that I explained earlier of eventually concluding the problem is Jews. I went down, and other people went down the path that the problem is liberalism. And Jews did not invent liberalism. Liberalism emerged out of Western Europe.
Yeah.
And it was Europeans in Western Europe that came up with that, not Jews that came up with that.
Even then, when you look
that doesn't mean that Western Europeans are the bad guys, by the way, but that ideology is what has eventually led to this moment.
I mean, if we wanted to do like a list of like prominent names, it would be people like Locke, Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then I think James Lindsay did a good job of distinguishing between, elements of liberalism from like the Scottish Enlightenment or even Lockeanism versus Jean-Jacques Rousseau or continental liberalism, which took on a very, very different turn. I would say one of the biggest differences between like your Locke and Rousseau is Rousseau, Voltaire, like the continental, it was like openly atheistic and secular. See, I don't chalk it all up to liberalism.
That's where you and I would disagree.
Yeah, I don't chalk it all up to liberalism. I chalk it up more to secularism. I think that I don't care what sort of worldview you use when you attempt to apply an atheistic viewpoint. You completely unmoor yourself from objective definitions of truth and morality. And any society that attempts to exist without objective truth and morality as like a core component of the culture will eat itself by necessity. Because and this is I gave this example when I was actually on Gen X Talks. Really, really good conversation there. And we were talking about this, kind of things degrading. And I said, well, if you think about it, it's the same problem going all the way back to the garden. Right? If you look at the Garden of Eden as the perfect human existence, and think about it, what do you have? First of all of your material needs are met. Right? You got all the food, you got a perfect environment, the whole deal. What's interesting is you also have your creative needs met because there were jobs in the Garden of Eden, right? It's not, the perfect world is not one long vacation. The perfect world is where you actually get to use your creative and physical faculties in order to do something, in order to maintain something, in order to build something, right? So you have perfect communion with God, perfect communion with other people, perfect environment where your needs are met, perfect environment where your creative and physical needs are met. And there's only one rule, because there has to be one rule if you have any sort of idea of freedom. And if you think about what Satan offered Eve, right? The first thing they did was they offered a competing truth claim. The competing truth claim is like, no, the tree does not, the knowledge of good and evil, that's not bad for you. It's not going to kill you. It's going to make you like God, knowing the difference from good and evil. But if you think about it, it wasn't just knowing the difference from good and evil. It was getting to basically redefine the categories. And so the whole lie was, no. The truth God told you is wrong. The truth I'm telling you is true, because there is no such thing as, even the claim that there is no such thing as objective truth is at its baseline a truth claim. And so if you look at all this, it's the closer a political ideology or a cultural ideology roots itself in this idea that you as the individual or you as a particular group or you as a whatever, you get to redefine reality in order to achieve your self-actualization, and any sort of restricting component, forget philosophy, forget theology, reality itself is now the enemy because it's restrictive. It's something you didn't consent to. And that is the part where I think you have the combination of both liberalism and secularism. Because if you have liberalism within like a Christian framework, what it essentially says is, no, you can only be liberal on these things. You don't get to be liberal on these things because these things are already decided. But the moment you say, no, there is no God. Well, now I get to be liberal on everything and any sort of restriction.
You become a Rawlsian comprehensive liberal.
Yes, anything that's a restriction on me is a problem. And that's going to have a backlash because inevitably, if everybody gets to make the rules, what really ends up happening is, no, the strongest get to make the rules. And the strongest in liberal democracies in the West over the past, because the strongest is generally defined by those who control the culturally shaping and legally shaping institutions. And that's largely been controlled by secular liberals. And the end result is now you're getting a backlash. And people like Fuentes are pointing to very, very easy enemies because it makes it, speaking of that friend-enemy distinction, the bad side of the friend-enemy distinction is when you start picking the wrong enemies, you start getting the wrong friends.
Well, who gets to define what a wrong enemy is, right? Every single group of people, only a political group gets to determine who their enemies are, right? The moment that you go in and say, well, they're picking the wrong enemies, you're making a moral judgment, which is exclusionary, which is itself an application of the friend-enemy distinction, right?
My argument is not with the friend-enemy distinction. My argument is with using terminology that people can understand within its proper context. And again, the argument, the distinction that we've made within the West is you and I are not enemies. We're fellow citizens and we're working through a process which we agree on. So the thing that we agree on is the process. All right. And then you could argue that the other thing that we agree on is there is such a thing as objective truth, objective morality. And we also agree that we're not always going to get it right. And that's why we have this process which facilitates peaceful transition of power and peaceful change. The problem that I think you have articulated and is correct is that works great as long as everybody kind of agrees with those notions. The moment you import someone or the moment you create something internally that is openly hostile to that network or that environment or that way of thinking, it starts to destroy itself because they're able to operate as a comprehensive, cohesive unit in order to beat you and use your system against you.
And you're just an atomized, apolitical individual that wants to live his own life.
Anton 13 said also, he goes, it's the feeling that institutions built for our benefit are being used to harm us. That's a huge shove towards conspiratorial thinking.
Yes, it is.
And that's
especially because that feeling is valid. But if you don't understand what is causing it, then you're going to end up thinking that the way that you win is by handing everything over to the left who hates you.
Yeah. Well,
right?
in Tom 13 said again, question, does liberalism naturally and necessarily detach itself from Christianity?
You and I might disagree on this.
I think you would probably say it does.
Yes.
I would say that it depends. I would say that liberalism is not a all-encompassing worldview. The moment you try to make liberalism an all-encompassing worldview, which is what the left largely does, it doesn't sustain itself.
It's not a complete worldview.
No,
it requires it requires a foundation that it cannot construct itself and that it actually needs in order to put it this way.
So my argument would be if you construct a limited liberalism on the foundation of Christianity, it can flourish. The moment you remove the Christianity or you pretend like it's not a necessary foundation, the question is, okay, what is the foundation? Because as Christian just pointed out, it doesn't create one for itself.
This is why Locke said we need to outlaw atheists.
Yeah, there are certain presuppositions that are necessary to make liberalism work. The left has rejected that and has simply adopted this kind of multicultural view of it. But even then, they're not multicultural. And they're not cultural relativists. They hate the West, right? So there will always be some sort of foundation that liberalism needs to sit on top of. And what we're finding out is that when you sit liberalism on top of secularism, it ends up getting swallowed up by something. If the left gets their way, you get Marx. If Islam gets its way, you get Sharia. But it doesn't, and therefore you kill liberalism. And I think the gambit that people like Nick Fuentes are saying is, I don't care as long as we kill liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. Here's ultimately the reason that this is happening in a way. We've joked before about Carl Benjamin's famous quote about how liberalism is Sharia law for the English.
For the
and
English,
I think he's spot on that it's a uniquely Anglo, it's not even a European or Western, it is uniquely Anglo, because the French and Germans were not liberals. Although I will say that Tacitus does write about how the Germans lived in the ancient world equivalent of single family housing.
Yeah.
And he was like, that's very different than the way that the Romans lived. But those same German tribes eventually became, the Anglo-Saxons, right? Yeah. At the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, a lot of Germanic tribes came over and moved into what eventually became England. That's why they're called Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah.
Saxony's in Germany, and the Angle was a peninsula that's around the area between Denmark and Germany. But the part of the problem here is that what we call, in a colloquial sense, liberalism, is a way of life for a particular group of people that it's in a way, it's an indigenous way of knowing. If you think about it, it's an English indigenous way of knowing.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
That is like,
that's fair.
If you go back in history, I already mentioned Tacitus during the Roman times, writing about how the Germanic tribes lived. And these are the same Germanic tribes that eventually colonized or moved into England.
Yeah.
This is over 2,000 years ago. If you look at the Middle Ages, the way that English peasants lived was different than the way that they lived on the continent.
Yeah.
English peasants moved around a lot more than their continental brethren. They were not quite nomadic in the way that horse tribes in Central Asia were nomadic, but they were not tied to the land in the same way that the French peasantry were tied to particular.
Are you referring to a time like after what we would call kind of the Great Migration?
No,
periods?
This is before like the enclosure movement.
Oh, got it.
Again, this is like in the Middle Ages.
Yeah,
and obviously the most famous example of this is the Magna Carta, which came out of the Middle Ages. Right, it was in the 1200s that the Magna Carta restricted the powers of the king. The king was no longer an absolute monarch. The nobility had a say in government. And there were certain rights that eventually became known as the rights of Englishmen that were further refined with the English Bill of Rights after the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So this has been a continuous process. But what we call, just in common parlance, liberalism is in many respects just the natural way of life for an Englishman. As somebody that is a descendant from that, as an American, which is a product of English civilization.
Yeah.
In a way, I identify as a post-liberal reactionary, but as an individual, there's many things that we would call liberal that I just kind of view as I couldn't even live living a different way.
It's
I don't even view it as ideological. It's just in the same way that if we called it tribalism, the Afghans would be like, no, this is just humanity. This is just how I live.
Yeah.
And the problem with liberalism, the ultimate problem of liberalism is its universalism. The reason ultimately that we have gotten to the Great Awakening, that we've gotten to explicit anti-white racism on the left, explicit anti-male misandry on the left, the reason that the left has done all of the things that they've done, open borders, mass migration, transgenderism, all of it, right? Pro-criminality, is because liberalism is effectively trying to overcome its own origins. If liberalism is properly understood as a unique way of life to a particular group of people with a long tradition that led to that moment, instead of a universal application of pure morality as expressed in the form of politics, the way that it currently markets itself, right? But instead, if it was understood as the way that I just previously described, then liberalism loses its almost mythological status.
Yeah.
And so how do you resolve that? By erasing your own origin story. And so liberalism hates white men because white men were the original liberals.
I think that's very interesting. I don't know that I agree with the conclusion. But I do think it's an interesting take. And I'm not necessarily offering a better one right now. I think I think so much of the thing we would both agree on is we think it's far more theological than it's given credit for. And that really is that's also the distinction I make. My frustration with Fuentes is Fuentes wants to put himself out there as a Catholic and say Christ is king, but then he will engage in activities which are, I think, blatantly anti-Christian. And one of my problems with Fuentes is I feel like he does the same things that the left does. He will take various institutions and he'll wear them around as a skin suit. And then the moment you question him, his followers come in and accuse you of being a subversive or being, paid off or whatever else. They don't even really engage with your arguments. That's been the most common thing that I've seen with Candace Owens, with Tucker Carlson, with Nick Fuentes. Fuentes will engage with arguments, but again, he does the Motte and Bailey tactic, which I don't think is an intellectually honest way to do it. It's the same thing with Tucker and Candace. It's like the moment you try to engage with the arguments, you get treated like, it's almost like mysticism. You don't have access to the special knowledge that they do, or you're bought off. And it's like, well, how am I supposed to argue with that? And really what it is, it's a manifestation of the left's way of arguing. If every time I try to engage with your argument and I bring up anything that potentially contradicts it, your immediate response is to judge me by my race, by my sex, or to accuse me of something for which I cannot possibly absolve myself of. How are you any different from the left with respect to the tactics that you're using? And their one answer will be like, well, I want a very different end state. Fair enough. You want a different end state, but you're still willing to use the same dishonest tactics in order to arrive at your end state. And I think that's because they become convinced that, well, if it works for them, it works for us. And the thing that I would contrast that with is if you really believe Christ is king, you don't get the option of throwing out objective truth and morality the way the Bible states it in order to serve your political interests. You don't get to it's not an option available to us. And that's the biggest question I have is, what are you truly subordinate to? If we're all subordinate to something, what are you truly subordinate to? I've made, you want to know my friend enemy distinction? I'm a Christian. I serve Christ. That in opposition to Christ has made itself my enemy. Not because, and even in scripture, what does it say? Your fight is not against flesh and blood. That's not to say that things can't manifest through flesh and blood. It's not to say you can't get in a fight with somebody or a war with somebody or what else. But it's about what is the ultimate argument? What is the ultimate thing that is taking place here? It's God's truth claim versus Satan's truth claim. If you really wanted to break it down in a way that was easy and identifiable, that's what Scripture says. Now, if you want to reject that, fine, then offer up your opposing explanation. But I think that makes a lot of sense. And I see it play out. I mean, it's the reason why I say over and over again, and people get frustrated because they think I'm being overly simplistic or I'm excluding various people from the conversation when I say, show me Christian men and women becoming Christian husbands and wives, raising Christian kids, right? Becoming Christian fathers and mothers. And I'll show you a country whose politics you probably don't have to deal with, provided that they're not just Christians in name only, that they actually believe it and apply it.
I love that you brought up that like some people get mad at me because, they're saying that I'm excluding some people from the conversation. Everybody excludes.
Yeah.
Everybody excludes. There is no universal polity. There is none. On this side of existence, actually, no. There is none in general.
There is none, period.
There is none in general. If you think about
the truth is by definition exclusive.
It's yes, that is true.
Yeah.
Like I have some people that when I made an argument once that like conflict is an intrinsic part of existence and life. And I'm not the first one that's made that argument. Heraclitus made that argument 2,000 plus years ago. Yeah. And I had somebody that was like, that's not very Christian. I'm like, the most perfect place to have ever existed experienced conflict when Satan said, I will not obey.
Yes.
So what exactly makes you think that you can eliminate conflict when conflict existed in heaven?
Well, the way I put it, I put it to Christians is because I run into a lot of Christians that believe that we're just supposed to be nice and peaceful. It's like, no, insofar it is within your power, live in peace with everyone. That's what our mandate is from Paul in the New Testament. But if you look at what Christ said, he goes, I will divide mother and daughter and father and son. Why? Because the truth is exclusive. And then the thing I point out to Christians too, I say, like, insofar as we have been taught to believe that if we just did it the right way, then people would understand, they would listen, or at the very least, they wouldn't hate us. I'm like,
That's not how this works.
I know somebody who did it the perfect way, and they crucified him. And by the way, when I say they, I hate it when people say, well, no, the Jews crucified him. Like, okay. If you understand Christian theology properly, you understand that Jesus died for all of our sins, which means insofar as any of us have sinned, that's everybody, we bear responsibility on some level for that sacrifice that had to be made for the propitiation of sins. But it's this idea that, when you look at it that way, that the guy who did it perfectly, the guy who he did it, I mean, with the exception of clearing out the temple, right? Didn't use violence, didn't try to do political overthrow, was going around healing and feeding people, right? Still got killed by the powers that be because it represented a threat to the status quo. And so what I try to get, Christians to understand, conservatives to understand is you need to be a lot more comfortable with conflict because it's inevitable. And Reagan said it this way when he was talking about it with respect to the Soviet Union. He goes, oh, if you want peace, you can have it tomorrow. It's just bought at the price of abject surrender. If you're willing to lay down and just whatever you tell me to do, I will do. Okay, you can have peace, but what's the cost associated with it? And that's the part where, unfortunately, I think on the right and unfortunately in the church, we have valued peace more than we valued the truth. And you can't do that.
Well, we're trying to avoid conflict. We think that the good thing to do is dissolve disagreement, basically, right? Is to seek out some sort of universal application of tolerance and acceptance and love and peace and all of these things. And that is not how existence works.
Yeah.
Polities emerge based on competing groups of people. Now, in fact, the danger in all of this is if you universalize so much, what you've now done is anybody that doesn't agree with my universalism must be destroyed as an enemy of humanity.
Well, this is where you get into the...
You were bringing up Schmidt earlier, right? He has that famous line, anybody who invokes humanity wants to cheat.
Yeah, well, the thing that I love is Karl Popper, right? Karl Popper's Open Society, George Soros, the Open Society Foundation. What's it all about? Tolerance. It's all about tolerance. And then the moment you say, well, you're not tolerating me or my perspective or my worldview, they immediately refer to Karl Popper's The Paradox of Tolerance, which is to say that the intolerant cannot be tolerated within society. Well, if you have a Christian worldview of tolerance, that makes sense. If you don't have a Christian worldview of tolerance, well, then what do you replace it with? Something else. Well, the woke foundation of an open society means you can't support anybody that isn't woke. They cannot be allowed because they will destroy your tolerant society. And so this is the whole point, right? The whole point is this doesn't sustain itself. Liberalism doesn't sustain itself. Tolerance devoid of objective truth and morality cannot sustain itself because it will by necessity destroy itself. If I'm tolerant of the person willing to murder me, I don't exist anymore. And their argument has been to say, like we would say, yes, you should be generally tolerant in the sense that you can tolerate different preferences in music or different preferences in food, or you might be able to tolerate different things where you do it in your house and I do this in my house, and that's just the way that we manage bedtimes or whatever it is, or the way we decorate. But the left then says, no, we're going to come up with a whole new set of moral criteria and moral categories where if you fall outside of that, you can't be tolerated. And it's not good enough that you just want to be left alone. No, you must comply. And that's where they get into the same people preaching tolerance become the totalitarians because it's devoid of an objective moral framework outside of themselves.
This is why, like, all political worldviews inevitably will create particularity, not universality. Even the ones that preach universality, you you can't escape this.
Yeah.
If you say my worldview is just simply synonymous with the pure application of morality, what you've done is you've now stripped,
what's the
you've
the meme on that?
dehumanized everybody.
I'm on team good guys. Anybody that's
we call ourselves the good guy squad, which means we're against the bad guys. And if you don't agree with us, then that means you're a bad guy, and we're just going to kill you, right? Or we're, like it's. What you've done is that you've created the conditions for you to wage total, unrelenting political war to the point of murdering your enemies, because you've stripped them of their humanity effectively. It's kind of like an undoing of the Westphalian system.
Yeah.
Where,
the whole concept of the Westphalian system is like, okay, if we can all agree that individual human beings have inherent worth as made in the image of God, but we can also agree that we have very big disagreements on how we should live, how we should worship, what we should do, fine. You do that over in your borders, we do that over in our borders. And what we tried to do in the United States
they didn't say we're not enemies, they were still enemies.
They said it's just you stay there, we stay there, and we won't kill each other over it. But then the other side of that is that if you look at the United States, we tried to carry this out down to the individual. You do it in your house, I'll do it in my house, and that's it. And what we found is that can work provided you have a significant high trust society where they share certain values. But the moment we get into this idea of we're going to use the state to compel, right, which it has to exist on some level, all laws are a form of compulsion. Well, now we have to go to, okay, what morality are we going to use? And what we found out is secularism doesn't sustain it. It just doesn't. Period. The end. All right. We are running up at the end of our time right now, but I'm going to give one more chance. So let's go back to the original question here. We've gone down kind of all the philosophy behind it, but I'm going to read off Nick Fuentes' tweet again. I want Christian's response, and I'll give mine. Nick Fuentes said, "I'm voting Democrat in 2026 because white people can play both sides too. The GOP broke every single promise. Epstein file cover-up, regime change, war in Iran, and no mass deportations. The GOP must be purged and burned to the ground in 26. Hostile takeover in 28. True, not true. Why not?"
I mean, he's just my enemy at this point. I don't really care if it's true or not. He's my enemy. I hope he fails. I know he's going to fail. Good luck trying to take over the same party that you're telling people to vote against. Yeah, best of luck, buddy. Really going to work out. Accelerationism is for retards. It doesn't work, and it doesn't work because there are still libtards in South Africa. Yeah. And you would think at this point, like I'll end with this. These same people would be telling their base, vote for the EFF in South Africa because the Democratic Alliance refuses to bring back apartheid.
Yeah.
and by the way, the EFF are like the kill the Boer, explicitly Marxist party.
Yeah.
Right? Like, just to give some context there. And the Democratic Alliance is like the center right, opposing the ANC and everybody else, but they never actually win anything.
Yeah.
And so accelerationism doesn't work. Nick Fuentes is just an enemy at this point. He's just an enemy. I don't know what else to say. He's an enemy who either doesn't understand how politics works, or he has a misconception of how to actually win. I think he's just functionally indistinguishable from the left. I mean, going back to that meme quote. So that's where I'm at this point. I'm really done engaging with him. If you're a fan of him, this isn't the place for you, and I have nothing more to say to you. You are my enemy. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think ever since Fuentes came on the scene, the biggest thing I noticed is that we don't share the same worldview, and I don't mean classical liberalism or anything like that. I mean, we don't share the same worldview with respect to our faith, because there are certain restrictions that I put on myself with respect to what I'm allowed to say, what I'm allowed to do, certain things I'm permitted, because it's not up to me, it's up to God. And what I see is Nick Fuentes has no such restrictions on his behavior, his advice, or whatnot. I do think he's a gifted speaker, and I do think he's a gifted content creator. And I think he knows how to stir up hostility. And by stir up hostility, I don't mean create it out of thin air. I mean, he sees things that are going on, he knows how to point it in a particular direction. And he certainly knows how to do so for his own personal advantage. And I agree. Like, anybody that is going to tell people that I'm the guy that really loves Jesus and I'm the guy that really loves America, now go vote for a party that aborts children through all 9 months of pregnancy and trans the ones that make it out. There's no world where Christ teams with Satan in order to achieve his end state. That's just not a thing. And if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to essentially support the party that is openly trying to fight everything that you claim to care about, well, I'm going to come to one of two conclusions. Either you don't understand how reality works, or you do, and you've been lying about what you believe and what you actually want. And I'm prone to believe that Nick Fuentes lies about what he actually believes and what he actually wants. That's my take. All right. Well, we hope you have enjoyed this. We are about to go into post-game with our community. That's right. The discussion doesn't stop here. We have an entire community. If you're interested in joining it, go check it out on Circle. But we're going to get to some other questions that have been popping up in the feed and see if we can answer those. Also, by the way, that's right. I have proven to everyone that I am capable of writing a book. I didn't say it was good. I hope it was. I hope it's good. I hope you like it. Basically what I did, it's called The Man Book. And what I did was I talked about some of my experiences being a husband for 26 years, a father for 22 years, a soldier, an elected official, all of those things. And I just talk about some of the things that I learned, a lot of it the hard way, and things that a lot of it I wish someone would have set me down and said, hey, Nick, I want to give you some insight into some things that you're going to experience as a husband, as a father, as a soldier, as an elected official. So if you think that might be interesting, you can pre-order The Man Book right now, pretty much anywhere you would pre-order a book. So go check that out. And of course, I have to plug for our Brew Around and Find Out coffee. That's right. If you want to do patriotic things faster, Brew Around and Find Out. It was put together by my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees, who actually grew up with her parents owning a coffee shop. So she knows a little something about getting just the right blend to get that really smooth, caffeination that we all need in order to fight for the things that we believe in. So go check out Brew Around and Find Out. Thank you again for watching. We're going to go into post game right now.